Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a time when survival wasn't a goal. It was a constant struggle you could never fully win. A time when the cold could kill you in your sleep, where a simple cut might mean the end of your life, and where comfort, as you know it, simply didn't exist. So before you get cozy, maybe adjust your blanket, dim the lights, and settle in, because tonight we're stepping into the quiet, unforgiving world of medieval life, and why you probably wouldn't last a single day. The winter fog had settled thick over the village, softening every edge, blurring every path, as if the world itself had grown tired and decided to rest beneath a layer of frost. The sun rose weakly behind a blanket of clouds, its light pale and distant, barely strong enough to cast shadows across the frozen ground. A church bell echoed slowly through the cold morning air, its sound stretching across the fields and through the narrow dirt lanes between homes. It wasn't loud or urgent. It was steady, patient, almost comforting in its repetition. For the villagers, it marked the beginning of another day. Not a new opportunity, not a fresh start, but simply another day to endure. Inside small wooden houses, families gathered close to their hearths. Fires burned low, carefully managed to conserve fuel. Smoke curled lazily upward, sometimes filling the room before finding its way out through small openings in the roof. The warmth was uneven, barely enough to fight back the cold pressing in from outside. If you were standing there, you'd notice it immediately. The cold wasn't just something you felt on your skin. It crept deeper, into your fingers, your breath, your bones. Food was already on everyone's mind. It always was. Winter meant scarcity. Whatever had been harvested in the autumn was all they had left, and there was never quite enough. Grains were stored carefully, root vegetables kept in dark corners, salted meat rationed out in small, measured portions. Every bite mattered. Every crumb had value. For many families, meals were simple and repetitive. A thin porridge, perhaps some coarse bread if flour remained, maybe boiled turnips or cabbage. Meat was rare, often reserved for those with more resources, or for special days that broke the monotony of survival. Hunger wasn't always sharp or dramatic. Sometimes it was quieter than that. A constant, dull presence in the background. A reminder that your body needed more than you could give it. Children felt it the most. Their bodies, still growing, struggled in ways adults often tried not to think about. They moved slower in winter, their energy drained, their cheeks pale beneath the cold. And the elderly, they faded quietly, often unable to withstand the long, unforgiving season. Outside, the village looked still, almost peaceful. Snow rested on rooftops like a soft blanket. Bare trees stretched thin branches into the gray sky, unmoving. The paths between homes were marked only by footprints that quickly disappeared under fresh frost. It might even seem beautiful if you didn't know what it took to live there. As the morning slowly unfolded, people stepped outside, wrapped in layers of rough wool and worn fabric. Their clothing was heavy, but not warm in the way you might expect. It scratched against the skin, stiff from repeated use, patched and repatched over the years. Gloves, if they had them, were thin. Shoes were often little more than leather coverings, offering minimal protection from the frozen ground beneath. Every step required attention. The earth had hardened into uneven ridges, and ice formed in patches that were easy to miss. A single fall could mean injury. And here, an injury wasn't just painful, it was dangerous. There were no hospitals waiting nearby, no emergency care, no quick recovery. A broken bone could change everything. Still, the work had to be done. Men made their way toward barns and storage areas, checking on animals that were just as vulnerable to the cold as they were. Cows, sheep, chickens, each one represented survival. Losing even one could mean less food, less income, less security in an already fragile existence. Women moved between tasks without pause, preparing food, tending fires, caring for children, repairing clothing. And when needed, they worked outside too, carrying water, gathering wood, assisting wherever they could. There was no true division between easy and hard work. Everything was necessary. Even children had responsibilities. Small hands carried kindling, fetched water, or helped with simple chores. There was little room for idleness. Survival didn't allow it. And then there was sickness. It lingered quietly, often unnoticed until it was too late. A cough that didn't go away. A fever that came suddenly in the night. A wound that darkened instead of healing. Without understanding of infection or bacteria, people relied on herbs, prayers, and tradition. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. Entire households could fall ill within days. And when someone died, life didn't stop. It couldn't. The rest of the village continued forward, carrying grief alongside their daily burdens. By midday, the light had shifted slightly, though the sun remained hidden. The cold didn't ease. If anything, it deepened, settling more firmly into the ground, the air, the walls of every home. Work continued without pause. Wood needed to be chopped. Water needed to be hauled, sometimes from partially frozen sources. Tools had to be repaired. Animals fed. Fires maintained. There was a rhythm to it all, not peaceful, not relaxing, but steady, predictable in its hardship. And somehow, people adapted to that rhythm, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. If you were placed here, without warning, without preparation, the reality would settle in quickly. The cold would overwhelm you. The hunger would distract you. The constant labor would exhaust you. And that's before sickness, injury, or sheer bad luck had their chance. Modern life has insulated you from these things. You have warmth at the push of a button. Food that's always available. medicine that can handle infections before they become life-threatening. Here, none of that exists. Every small inconvenience you experience today would be magnified into something serious, something dangerous, something that could end your story before it even truly began. As the day slowly faded, the village began to quiet once again. People returned to their homes, carrying what little they had gathered or completed. Doors closed. Fires were stoked carefully, never too large, never too wasteful. Inside, families gathered in dim light, their movements slower now, their energy spent. Conversations were soft, often unnecessary. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been lived. Outside, the cold took over completely. The paths emptied. The fields stood silent. The world seemed frozen in place. And as night settled in, stretching long and heavy across the land, the villagers prepared to do it all again tomorrow. Because in this world, survival wasn't something you achieved once. It was something you had to earn every single day. And sometime in the deep hours of the night, when even the faint glow of embers had dimmed, and the wind whispered softly against the wooden walls, the cold crept further inside. It found its way through tiny cracks in the timber, through the thatched roofing, through the spaces beneath doors that never quite sealed shut. It moved slowly, patiently, as if it had all the time in the world, which, in a way, it did. Inside one of the smaller homes at the edge of the village, a family slept in close proximity, not out of affection, but necessity. Bodies shared warmth in ways blankets could not. A mother lay closest to the fire, or what remained of it, her hand resting lightly over a child curled beside her. The child's breathing was shallow, but steady, small puffs of warmth visible in the frigid air. Across from them, a man shifted slightly in his sleep, pulling a rough wool covering tighter around his shoulders. Though it offered little comfort now, sleep in this place was never truly deep. It was something closer to waiting, waiting for morning, waiting for light, waiting to see if everyone had made it through the night. Eventually, the darkness began to lift, not suddenly, but gradually, as a faint gray replaced the black sky beyond the narrow window opening. The cold did not retreat with the coming dawn. If anything, it seemed sharper now, biting more deliberately at exposed skin. The first to wake was the man, not because he was rested, but because routine demanded it. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim light, his breath already visible as he exhaled. For a moment, he remained still, listening. The soft breathing of his family, the distant creak of wood, the faint, ever-present wind. Then, with quiet effort, he pushed himself upright. The movement alone was enough to send a chill through him. The warmth he had gathered during the night disappeared almost instantly, replaced by the harsh reality of the morning air. His feet touched the ground, and he winced slightly at the cold seeping through the thin material wrapped around them. There was no time to linger. He moved toward the hearth, crouching low, inspecting the faint glow beneath layers of ash. Carefully, he stirred it, adding a few small pieces of kindling, just enough to bring it back, not enough to waste what little fuel they had. Flames flickered weakly at first, then steadied into a modest, controlled burn. Behind him, the woman stirred. She did not speak. There was no need. She knew the routine just as well. Rising slowly, she adjusted her clothing, wrapping an extra layer around her shoulders before moving to begin her tasks. Water would need to be fetched. Food prepared, whatever that meant today. Clothing checked, perhaps mended if time allowed. The list never ended. It only shifted slightly from one day to the next. Outside, the village was already beginning to wake, not with noise, but with movement. Doors opened cautiously. Figures stepped out into the cold, their forms hunched slightly against the wind. Smoke began to rise again from rooftops, thin lines stretching into the pale sky. The man stepped out as well, carrying a wooden pail. The cold struck him immediately, sharper than before, as if the night had gathered strength while everyone slept. His breath came faster now, not from exertion, but from the body's instinctive reaction to the freezing air. The ground beneath him was uneven, hardened into ridges and patches of ice that reflected the dim morning light. Each step had to be placed carefully. One misstep could lead to a fall, and here, a fall was never just a fall. He moved toward the water source, a shallow well partially covered to prevent freezing. Already, a small line had formed. Others stood waiting, silent for the most part, shifting their weight occasionally, their faces expressionless but tired. There were no greetings exchanged, no casual conversation. Words required energy, and energy was not something to waste. When his turn came, he worked quickly, lowering the bucket, pulling it back up with steady hands. The rope was rough, biting into his skin, but he did not react. He had done this too many times for it to matter now. Returning home, he passed others beginning their own routines. A boy struggling to carry a bundle of wood larger than his arms could comfortably hold. An older man walking slowly, leaning slightly to one side, his steps uneven but determined. A woman brushing snow away from the entrance of her home, her movements methodical and practiced. No one stopped, no one lingered. Back inside, the small fire had grown slightly stronger. The woman had begun preparing the morning meal, if it could be called that. A thin mixture simmered in a pot, giving off a faint, earthy smell. It would not satisfy hunger, but it would quiet it, at least for a while. The child had woken now, sitting quietly, watching the steam rise from the pot. There was no excitement in their expression, no anticipation, just a quiet awareness of what the day would bring, even at such a young age. They ate in silence, small portions carefully divided. No one took more than their share. There was an understanding, unspoken, but absolute. Once finished, the day truly began. The man gathered tools, checking each one briefly before stepping back outside. There was fencing to repair damage from the cold, perhaps from animals searching for food. If left unattended, it could lead to greater problems. The woman turned to other tasks, cleaning what little space they had, organizing supplies, ensuring nothing was wasted or misplaced. Every item had value. Every scrap mattered. Time passed slowly, measured not by clocks, but by tasks completed and light shifting across the sky. As the morning stretched toward midday, the village settled into its familiar rhythm once more. Repetitive, demanding, unforgiving. And yet, beneath it all, there was something else. Not comfort, not ease, but endurance. A quiet, steady persistence that carried each person forward, step by step, through the cold, through the hunger, through the endless demands of survival. Because here, there was no alternative, only continuation. Only the next task, the next breath, the next moment. And somewhere beyond the village, beyond the frozen fields and silent trees, the world continued to turn, unnoticed, unchanged by the struggles of those who lived within this small, fragile place. The day would go on, and so would they. The pale light of morning never fully brightened, instead lingering in a dull gray that seemed to flatten everything it touched. The sky remained heavy, as though the sun had decided not to rise properly at all. Even the faint warmth it might have offered was absent, leaving the village wrapped in a quiet, unmoving chill. The man worked steadily along the edge of the fence, his hands stiff but deliberate. The wood had split in places where frost had forced itself deep into the grain, expanding slowly over nights of relentless cold. Each broken section required attention. Each repair demanded effort that his body resisted, but habit overruled discomfort. Nearby, the animals shifted restlessly. They were thinner now than they had been in autumn, their ribs faintly visible beneath coarse fur. They moved less, conserving energy, their breath forming soft clouds in the cold air. Feeding them had become a careful calculation. Too much, and supplies would vanish too quickly. Too little, and they would not survive the season. He paused for a moment, not to rest, but to observe. This pause was part of the rhythm as well. A quiet assessment of what remained, what needed to be done, and what could no longer be avoided. The fence would hold for now. That was enough. He turned back toward the village, his steps slow but steady, each one placed with the same caution as before. The ground had not softened. It would not soften for many days yet. At the same time, within the cluster of small homes, the woman continued her work. The interior of the house had grown slightly warmer, though only by a small margin. The fire demanded constant attention, never allowed to grow too large, never allowed to die completely. She moved with quiet efficiency, adjusting small things that others might overlook. a piece of cloth repositioned to block a draft. A container shifted closer to the fire to prevent freezing. A worn garment examined closely. It seems weakening with each use. There was no sense of completion in these tasks. They did not end. They simply continued, blending into one another until the passage of time became difficult to measure. The child sat nearby, watching for a while before being handed a small task. A bundle of thin sticks needed arranging near the hearth. It was not difficult work, but it carried importance. Even the smallest contribution mattered here. Outside, a faint sound broke the steady quiet. Not loud, not sudden, but noticeable. The distant creak of something heavy shifting, followed by a brief murmur of voices. The man heard it as he approached the center of the village. Others paused as well, their attention drawn not by curiosity, but by instinct. Any change in the pattern of the day was worth noticing. Near one of the larger homes, a small group had gathered. Their posture was different from the usual rhythm of work. Slower, more still. No one rushed. There was no urgency in their movements. Instead, there was a kind of quiet understanding passing between them. As the man drew closer, the reason became clear. An older villager, someone who had been seen moving slowly through the lanes for years, was no longer standing. The body lay covered, carefully arranged, not abandoned, not ignored. Just still. There was no shock in the faces around him. No visible panic, only recognition. Winter had taken another. The man did not stop long. He did not need to. The moment was understood without words. This, too, was part of life here. Not unexpected, not unusual. He lowered his gaze briefly, then continued on his way, because there was always more to be done. Back at the house, the woman had sensed the shift without seeing it directly. News traveled in subtle ways. A change in movement, a pause in the air, the absence of someone who was usually present. She did not ask. There was no need. Instead, she continued her work, though her movements slowed slightly, just for a moment. Then they returned to their usual pace. The child, unaware of the full meaning, glanced toward the door, then back to the small pile of sticks. The world, at that age, was still limited to what could be seen and touched. Midday passed without announcement. The light did not change enough to mark it clearly. Only the body could tell through fatigue, through hunger returning once again, through the subtle shift in the air. The man returned carrying a small bundle of wood, less than he might have gathered in another season. Supplies were harder to find now. What remained nearby had already been collected. Venturing farther meant risk. Inside, the bundle was set down carefully. Nothing was dropped, nothing handled carelessly. Every piece had value. A second meal, if it could be called that, was prepared in the same quiet manner as the first. Slightly thicker this time, though not by much. Enough to continue. Never enough to satisfy. They ate as before. No conversation, only the soft sound of movement, the occasional shift of the fire. Afterward, there was no rest, only a change in tasks. The man turned to repairing a tool, its wooden handle weakened from use. The woman worked with needle and thread, reinforcing worn fabric with steady, practiced motions. The child remained close, observing, learning without instruction. Time continued its slow movement forward. Outside, the sky darkened slightly, though it had never truly been bright. The cold deepened once again, settling in with quiet persistence. A light wind began to move through the village, brushing against walls, slipping through gaps, carrying with it fine particles of snow that drifted softly across the ground. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, just a steady reminder that winter was not finished. As evening approached, the activity of the village began to fade once more. Figures returned indoors, their movements slower now, their energy worn down by the demands of the day. Doors closed, fires were tended. The outside world was left to the cold. Inside the house, the small space filled again with the soft glow of firelight. Shadows moved along the walls, shifting gently with each flicker of flame. The family gathered as before, drawn together not by choice, but by necessity. The man sat quietly, his hands resting still for the first time that day. The woman adjusted the fire once more, ensuring it would last through the night. The child leaned slightly closer to the warmth, eyes growing heavy. No words were needed. The day had been lived. That was enough. Outside, the wind continued its slow movement, tracing the edges of the village, slipping between buildings, carrying the cold into every exposed space. And as darkness settled fully once again, the world returned to that same quiet stillness. Not peaceful, not entirely, but steady, unchanging, and waiting for morning to come again. The night stretched on without interruption, the darkness thick and complete, broken only by the faint, unsteady glow of embers slowly fatting in the hearth. Outside, the wind had grown quieter, no longer pressing so firmly against the walls, but still present, moving gently through the village, as if tracing the same paths it had followed for years. Inside, warmth had diminished again. What remained clung close to the fire, barely reaching the corners of the room. The family lay as they had before, close together, their breathing slow and even. From time to time, one of them would shift slightly, adjusting position in search of comfort that never fully came. Hours passed in the stillness. At some point before dawn, the cold reached its deepest intensity. It settled into the ground, into the wood of the house, into the air itself. Even the faint warmth of shared body heat seemed less effective against it. The kind of cold that did not shock, but endured, steady, persistent, impossible to ignore. Then, gradually, the darkness began to loosen its hold. It was subtle at first, a faint, softening near the edges of the window opening, where black turned to a dim gray. The shapes inside the room became slightly clearer, though still muted and indistinct. Morning approached once again, not with brightness, but with a quiet shift in tone. The man woke as he always did, without hesitation, without delay. There was no lingering in sleep, no moment of comfort before rising. His body moved because it had learned to do so, guided more by routine than by rest. He sat up slowly, exhaling a visible breath, and paused for a moment, listening. The same sounds greeted him, the faint wind outside, the soft breathing of his family, the quiet crackle of dying embers. Reaching forward, he stirred the hearth again, uncovering what little warmth remained beneath the ash. A few carefully chosen pieces of kindling were added, coaxing the fire back to life. The flames rose reluctantly, flickering low before settling into a small but steady burn. Behind him, the woman stirred as well. Her movements were slower this time, the weight of repeated days settling into her limbs. Still, she rose, adjusting her clothing and moving toward her tasks without a word. The child remained still for a while longer, wrapped tightly, reluctant to leave what little warmth remained. But even that would not last. Soon enough, small movements signaled the beginning of another day. Outside, the village followed the same quiet pattern. Doors opened. Figures stepped out into the cold. The world resumed its slow, deliberate motion. The sky looked much the same as before, heavy, gray, unchanging. Snow had fallen lightly during the night, covering the ground in a thin, fresh layer that softened the edges of everything it touched. Footprints from the previous day had disappeared, replaced by a smooth, undisturbed surface. For a brief moment, the village appeared untouched. Then the first footsteps broke that illusion. The man stepped out once again, the cold greeting him immediately, as it always did. He adjusted the rough layers around him and began his walk, this time heading beyond the usual paths. There was less wood nearby now. Each passing day required going a little farther, searching a little longer. It was a slow expansion outward, not by choice, but by necessity. The ground beneath the fresh snow was uneven, hidden hazards concealed beneath a thin, white covering. Each step required attention. A misplaced foot could sink unexpectedly or slide against ice. As he moved beyond the cluster of homes, the sounds of the village faded behind him. The soft murmur of activity gave way to a deeper quiet. Only the faint crunch of snow beneath his feet and the distant whisper of wind remained. The trees ahead stood bare and motionless, their branches thin and dark against the pale sky. They offered wood, but not easily. Fallen branches were scarce, already collected by others who had passed this way. What remained required effort to obtain. He worked slowly, selecting what he could, breaking smaller limbs where possible, gathering them into a manageable bundle. cold made everything more difficult. Fingers stiffened quickly. Movements lost their precision. Still, he continued. Time passed without clear measure. The light shifted slightly, though never enough to feel like true daylight. The bundle grew piece by piece until it was enough. Not plentiful, not secure, but enough to last a little longer. Meanwhile, back in the village, the woman had stepped outside as well, carrying a smaller container. The water source remained partially frozen, its surface requiring effort to break through each morning. Others had gathered again, though fewer than before. The absence of the previous day lingered quietly among them. No one spoke of it, but it was felt in the spaces left behind. She waited her turn, her breath steady, her movements economical. When the time came, she worked quickly, retrieving what was needed before stepping aside for the next person. On her return, she paused briefly, adjusting her grip, her eyes scanning the village without focusing on anything in particular. The same homes, the same paths, the same routines, and yet always slightly different. Back inside, the fire was maintained carefully. The child added small pieces of kindling as instructed, watching closely to ensure the flames did not grow too large. Learning came not from explanation, but from repetition. The morning meal was prepared once more, nearly identical to the day before. Slight variations in texture or thickness were the only changes. They ate again in silence. Outside, the man returned, his bundle of wood resting against his shoulder. Each step carried a quiet strain, though he showed little outward sign of it. The effort was expected. It did not need acknowledgement. The wood was placed inside, sorted immediately. Larger pieces set aside, smaller ones closer to the hearth. Nothing left unorganized. The day continued. Tasks shifted, but never ceased. Repairs, maintenance, small adjustments to keep everything functioning just well enough. The village existed in a constant state of preservation, always on the edge of decline, always held together by effort. By midday, a faint change appeared in the sky. Not brightness, but movement. The clouds seemed thinner in places, allowing a slightly different quality of light to filter through. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable unless one was looking for it. Still, it changed nothing. The cold remained. The work continued. As the hours passed, a distant sound carried faintly across the fields. Not the usual quiet movement of wind or animals, but something else, dull, irregular, difficult to place. A few heads turned, not sharply, but with quiet awareness. The man paused briefly, listening. The sound came again, slightly clearer now. Not close, but not entirely distant either. He did not move toward it. No one did. Instead, they waited, because in a place like this, unfamiliar sounds were not approached without reason. They were observed, considered, and sometimes avoided. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the sound away again, leaving only silence in its place. Whatever it had been, it faded for now, leaving behind only the memory of its presence. Work resumed. The moment passed, absorbed into the steady rhythm of the day. As evening began its slow return, the village once again drew inward. Figures moved back toward their homes, their outlines soft against the dimming light. Inside, the fire was fed carefully. The warmth it provided, though limited, was enough to gather around. The family settled once more into their familiar positions. The same space, the same routine, the same quiet endurance. And outside, beyond the reach of the small, flickering light, the cold continued its patient hold over the land. The cold deepened again as the last traces of daylight faded into a heavy, unmoving darkness. Inside the house, the fire gave off a steady but modest glow, its light shifting gently across the rough wooden walls. Shadows stretched and curled with each flicker, never still, never fully forming into anything recognizable. The family remained close to the hearth, their movements slower now, shaped by the weight of another day carried through effort rather than ease. The man adjusted a small piece of wood in the fire, watching carefully as it caught, ensuring that nothing burned too quickly. The woman sat nearby, her hands resting briefly in her lap before returning to a piece of worn fabric that needed reinforcing. Even in the dim light, her fingers moved with practiced precision, guided more by memory than sight. The child leaned against the wall, eyes half closed, drifting in and out of a quiet stillness that came not from comfort, but from exhaustion. The rhythm of the day had worn down even the smallest reserves of energy. Outside, the village had grown silent once more. Doors had been shut, pathways emptied, and the faint traces of movement erased by a light sweep of drifting snow. The world beyond the walls felt distant now, reduced to the occasional whisper of wind brushing against the structure of the house. Time passed without clear measure. The fire burned lower. The air cooled again. And slowly, one by one, they lay down to rest, arranging themselves in familiar positions, close enough to share warmth, careful not to disturb what little comfort they could gather. Sleep came gradually, not deep, not uninterrupted, but enough. Hours slipped by unnoticed, carried forward by the steady turning of the night. The embers dimmed further, their glow reduced to faint points of red beneath a thin layer of ash. The cold pressed inward again, reclaiming space inch by inch, settling into every corner, every surface, every breath. Then, somewhere in that quiet stretch before morning, a sound returned. It was faint at first, so subtle it could have been mistaken for part of the wind. A low, uneven rhythm that did not match the usual patterns of the night. The man stirred slightly, his awareness shifting even before his eyes opened. He remained still, listening. There it was again, distant, irregular, not constant enough to be wind, not sharp enough to be something breaking, something moving. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the darkness. He did not rise immediately. Instead, he listened more carefully, focusing past the soft breathing in the room, past the quiet crackle of dying embers. The sound came once more. This time, it seemed closer, not near enough to be immediate danger, but no longer distant enough to ignore entirely. He sat up quietly, careful not to wake the others. The movement alone let in a wave of cold that had settled around him, but he did not react. His attention remained fixed outward. For a moment, everything was still. Then again, a dull crunch followed by a pause. Footsteps, slow, uneven, not part of the village's usual rhythm. No one moved like that at this hour, unless there was reason. He rose carefully, stepping toward the door. Each movement was deliberate, controlled, avoiding unnecessary sound. The wooden floor beneath him creaked faintly, but not enough to disturb the others. Reaching the door, he paused, his hand resting lightly against the rough surface. The cold seeped through immediately. Another step outside. Closer now. He opened the door slightly, just enough to see. The night greeted him with its familiar stillness. The sky remained dark, clouded, offering no moonlight to guide the eye. The ground was pale beneath a thin layer of snow, reflecting what little light existed. At first, there was nothing. Then movement. A figure barely visible, emerging along the path that led toward the village. Slow, unsteady, the man did not step outside. He remained where he was, watching. The figure moved closer, each step uneven, as though the ground itself resisted them. There was no attempt at stealth, no sign of urgency, only persistence. As the distance closed, more details became clear. A person wrapped in heavy, worn layers, though not enough to fully guard against the cold. Their posture leaned forward slightly, as if each step required effort beyond what remained. No tools, no animals, no sign of belonging to the village. A traveler, or something close to it. The man's grip on the door tightened slightly, though his expression did not change. Visitors were not common in this season. Not impossible, but rare. The figure stopped several paces away, as if reaching the edge of what strength allowed. For a moment, they stood still, breathing visible in short, uneven bursts. Then slowly, they lifted a hand. Not a wave, not a signal, just a small movement. Enough to show awareness, enough to show they had seen him. No words were exchanged. The silence between them held for several moments, stretching longer than it might have in another place, another time. The man considered, not quickly, not carelessly, because here, every decision carried weight. Food was limited. Space was limited. Trust was not easily given, but so was survival. And standing there, in the quiet cold of the night, it was clear that the figure would not last long without shelter. The wind shifted slightly, brushing past them both, carrying with it the same steady chill that had settled over everything. Finally, the man stepped back, opening the door wider. A simple action, an invitation. The figure did not move immediately, as if unsure, or perhaps gathering what little strength remained. Then, slowly, they took a step forward. Then another. Crossing the short distance felt longer than it was. Each movement deliberate, each breath visible, each step marked by the faint crunch of snow beneath worn footwear. When they reached the doorway, they paused once more, their head lowering slightly, not quite a bow, not quite exhaustion, but something between the two. The man stepped aside. No words. The figure entered. The warmth inside, though minimal, was immediate compared to the cold outside. The door closed behind them with a soft, final sound, sealing out the night once more. The woman had woken by now, her eyes adjusting quickly, taking in the presence of the stranger without surprise, but with quiet awareness. She said nothing, only shifting slightly to make space. The child stirred, glancing briefly toward the unfamiliar shape before settling again, too tired to fully process the change. The stranger remained near the door for a moment, as if unsure whether to move further. Their breathing was still uneven, their movements slow. The man gestured lightly toward the hearth. Again, no words. The figure moved closer, lowering themselves carefully near the fire. Their hands extended toward the faint warmth, fingers trembling slightly. Whether from cold or fatigue was unclear. The firelight revealed little more, just the outline of a face, worn, tired, marked by travel or hardship. Nothing unusual, and yet everything about their presence felt different. Outside, the village remained silent, unaware or unconcerned with what had just changed inside this small home. But within these walls, something had shifted, not dramatically, not suddenly, just enough to alter the rhythm. And as the fire flickered softly, casting its dim light across 4 quiet figures instead of 3, the night continued, unchanged in its cold, but no longer quite the same as before. The fire settled into a steady rhythm again, its faint crackling filling the silence in a way that almost felt like sound without being disruptive. The stranger remained close to the hearth, hands still extended toward the warmth, though the trembling had begun to ease. Steam rose faintly from damp fabric, the cold slowly releasing its hold. No one spoke. It was not unusual. Words were rarely used without purpose, and at this hour, with energy already spent, silence was easier. Still, the presence of someone unfamiliar shifted the space in subtle ways. The room felt smaller, the air slightly more occupied, the quiet no longer entirely their own. The man returned to his place, though he did not lie down immediately. His posture remained upright, watchful, without appearing tense. His gaze moved occasionally toward the stranger, not with suspicion alone, but with quiet assessment. The woman, having made space without hesitation, now observed from where she sat. Her hands had stilled, the fabric resting in her lap, forgotten for the moment. She studied the stranger's movements, the way they held themselves, the rhythm of their breathing. These small details mattered more than words ever could. The child, only half aware, shifted slightly closer to the warmth, glancing once more before allowing sleep to take over again. The unfamiliar had been noted, but not yet understood. Time moved slowly, marked only by the soft changes in the fire. After a while, the stranger lowered their hands, the stiffness in their fingers easing enough to allow movement. They adjusted their position carefully, as if testing whether their body would respond as expected. A quiet exhale followed, longer this time, less strained. Still no words. Eventually, the man reached for a small wooden container near the hearth. He hesitated only briefly before pushing it gently across the floor toward the stranger. Inside was a modest portion of what remained from earlier, a thin mixture, cooled but still edible. The stranger looked down at it, then up again. The firelight caught their face more clearly now, revealing features worn not just by the cold, but by time and distance. Their expression did not change much, but something in their posture softened slightly. They accepted the offering with a small, almost imperceptible movement. Eating was slow, careful, not out of hesitation, but necessity. The body, pushed too far for too long, could not simply return to normal all at once. Each small bite was taken with restraint, as if the act itself required effort. The others did not watch openly, but they were aware. Sharing food was not a simple gesture here. It was a decision, one that carried weight beyond the moment. When the small portion was finished, the container was set aside with equal care. The stranger leaned back slightly, closer to the wall now, their breathing more even than before. Outside, the night remained unchanged. The wind moved softly through the village, brushing against walls and rooftops, carrying the same cold that had defined every hour before. Nothing in the larger world had shifted. Inside, however, the balance had altered. Eventually, the man lay down, though not as deeply as before. His rest would be lighter now, shaped by awareness rather than exhaustion alone. The woman followed, though her position remained slightly turned, as if part of her attention stayed with the stranger even as her eyes closed. The fire burned low again, and slowly the house returned to a quiet stillness, not quite the same as before, but close enough that sleep, however fragile, could take hold once more. Hours passed. The cold reached its peak again before dawn, pressing in with the same steady persistence. The embers dimmed, their glow barely visible now beneath ash that had settled undisturbed. Then, as before, the darkness began to fade. Morning approached quietly, without announcement. The The man woke first. This time, his awareness shifted immediately toward the stranger before anything else. A quick glance confirmed what mattered. The figure remained where they had been, still, but breathing steady. Only then did he turn to the hearth, repeating the now familiar motions. Ash stirred, kindling placed, fire coaxed back into life. The woman rose soon after, her movements unchanged, though her gaze lingered briefly as well. No words passed between them, but the shared understanding remained. The child woke last, slower this time, blinking in the dim light before noticing the additional presence more clearly than before. There was no fear, only curiosity, though it remained unspoken. The stranger stirred as the warmth returned. Their movements were less strained now, though still careful. Sitting up slowly, they adjusted their position, glancing around the small space with a quiet awareness that suggested they were fully present once again. For a moment, no one moved. Then the man spoke. His voice was low, steady, shaped by disuse as much as by intention. The words themselves were simple, not elaborate, not unnecessary. A question, direct and without ornament. The stranger listened, then responded after a brief pause. Their voice carried a different tone, not unfamiliar, but shaped by distance, by places beyond the village. The words were measured, chosen carefully, as if each one mattered. The exchange was brief. Names were not given immediately. They were not the first thing that mattered. Instead, what passed between them was more practical, where the stranger had come from, how far they had traveled, what had brought them here in the middle of winter, when movement itself was a risk. The answers came slowly, not because they were hidden, but because they required effort to form. The journey had been long, longer than it should have been at this time of year. Conditions had worsened. Paths had become unclear. Supplies had run low sooner than expected. Nothing unusual, and yet enough to bring someone here, to this place, at this time. The man listened without interruption. The woman continued her tasks, though her attention remained partly on the conversation. The child watched quietly, absorbing what little could be understood. When the exchange ended, there was no immediate conclusion, no decision spoken aloud. Instead, the day began again. The fire strengthened slightly. The morning meal was prepared, divided once more, this time into 4 portions instead of 3. Slightly smaller, barely noticeable, but enough to be understood. The stranger accepted their share with the same quiet acknowledgement as before. Outside, the village stirred once again, unaware that within this single home, the pattern had shifted. The man prepared to leave, gathering what was needed for the day ahead. This time, there was a pause before stepping out. A brief glance toward the stranger, not questioning, not inviting, just nodding. Then he stepped into the cold once more. The woman remained inside, continuing her work, though now there was an added presence moving carefully within the space. The stranger did not interfere, did not take more than what was given. Their movements were deliberate, respectful of boundaries that had not been spoken, but were clearly understood. And so, without announcement, without any clear moment of change, the rhythm of the house adjusted. Not broken, not replaced, just expanded. The morning unfolded with the same muted light, though now the space inside the house carried a slightly different weight. Not heavier, not lighter, just altered in a way that could not be easily named. The fire burned steadily, its warmth shared among 4 instead of 3, each person adjusting without discussion, without visible effort. The woman moved through her tasks as she always had, though now her awareness extended beyond the familiar boundaries. The stranger remained near the wall at first, observing quietly, as if learning the rhythm before stepping into it. Their movements were careful, never abrupt, never intrusive. After some time, they shifted slightly closer to the hearth, reaching for a small piece of wood that had been set aside. There was a pause, brief, almost hesitant, before placing it into the fire in the same controlled manner they had seen before. Not too much, not too little. The woman noticed. She said nothing, but the smallest acknowledgement passed between them, not through words, but through the absence of correction. Outside, the man moved beyond the immediate paths again, his figure gradually fading into the pale distance. The work waiting for him had not changed. The cold had not lessened. Yet something in the back of his awareness remained connected to the house in a new way. He walked further than the day before. The closer areas had already been stripped of what little could be gathered. Branches once easily found were now scarce, leaving only those that required more effort, more time, more exposure to the cold. Each step outward was a quiet calculation, how far he could go, how much he could carry, how much risk he could take without pushing too far. The land beyond the village remained still, its silence deeper than within the clustered homes. Trees stood motionless, their dark forms rising against the gray sky, their branches bare and unyielding. Snow covered the ground unevenly, hiding dips and hardened ridges beneath a surface that looked deceptively smooth. He worked without pause, gathering what he could, testing each piece before committing to the effort of carrying it back. The cold pressed in steadily, working its way through layers, dulling sensation in fingers and face. Time passed. Back in the house, the rhythm continued to adjust in small, almost invisible ways. The stranger no longer remained entirely still. After watching, after learning, they began to take on the smallest of tasks, shifting a container closer to the fire, brushing away a thin layer of ash, adjusting an item that had been left slightly out of place. Nothing unnecessary, nothing that would overstep. The woman allowed it, not fully accepting, not fully trusting, but not refusing either. In a place like this, usefulness mattered. Actions spoke more clearly than intention. The child watched closely. The presence of someone new, someone different, held a quiet fascination. There were differences in movement, in posture, even in the way the stranger handled simple objects. Subtle things, but noticeable to eyes that had known only one way of living. At one point, the stranger reached into their own worn layers, retrieving something small. It was wrapped carefully, protected despite its size. They hesitated briefly, then opened it just enough to reveal its contents. Dried herbs, not many, not fresh, but preserved well enough to still hold some use. The woman's gaze shifted immediately. This was something different, something not easily found here, especially in winter. She moved slightly closer, examining without touching. The scent, faint but present, carried a hint of something unfamiliar, sharp, earthy, carrying a memory of seasons that felt distant now. The stranger spoke quietly then, their voice steady, explaining in simple terms. Not offering more than necessary, not drawing attention, just stating what it was, how it could be used. The woman listened. There was no immediate reaction. But the herbs were accepted, set aside carefully, placed where they would not be wasted. Another small shift. Outside, the man finished gathering what he could. The bundle was smaller than he would have preferred, but enough to justify the distance. Turning back toward the village, he adjusted his grip and began the return. The walk back felt longer, not because the path had changed, but because the weight of effort had begun to settle into his body. Each step required more awareness now. The cold had worked its way deeper, slowing movement, tightening muscles that had already been strained by repetition. Still, he continued. The village came into view slowly, its shapes emerging through the gray light. Smoke rose faintly from several homes, thin lines marking where life continued within. As he approached, the familiar paths welcomed him back, not with comfort, but with recognition. Inside the house, the fire had been maintained well. The warmth, though limited, was steady. The woman had begun preparing the midday meal, this time adding a small portion of the herbs. The scent shifted slightly, barely noticeable, but enough to change the air within the room. The child noticed first, though could not name it. The stranger remained quiet, watching, their expression unchanged, but their attention focused. When the man entered, the shift in the air did not go unnoticed. He paused briefly, setting down the bundle of wood, his gaze moving toward the hearth. It was subtle, but different. He said nothing. The wood was sorted, placed where it would be needed most. His movements remained steady, though a small part of his attention lingered on the unfamiliar presence, woven now into something as basic as food. They ate together again, 4 portions, slightly smaller still. The difference in taste was faint, but real. Not enough to change the meal, but enough to remind them that something new had entered their routine. Afterward, the day continued as it always did, but not exactly as before. The stranger took on more tasks now, still small, still careful. A tool was adjusted correctly without being shown. A piece of wood split along the right grain. Movements that suggested experience, not necessarily from this place, but from somewhere not entirely different. The man observed, not openly, not constantly, but enough. As the light began to fade once more, the familiar pull of evening returned. The cold pressed in again, steady and unchanging. Outside, the village quieted, drawing inward as it always did. Inside, the fire was fed carefully. The space filled once more with that dim, flickering glow. 4 figures gathered again, closer now, not by intention, but by necessity. No one spoke of the change. No one marked its beginning, but it was there, in the way tasks were shared, in the way space was adjusted, in the way silence no longer felt quite as empty. And as the night settled in once more, stretching long and quiet across the frozen land, the rhythm continued, steady, unbroken, yet no longer quite the same as it had been before. Night returned with the same quiet certainty, settling over the village like a weight that no one resisted anymore. Inside the house, the fire flickered steadily, its light stretching across the walls in long, wavering shadows. The air carried a faint trace of the herbs used earlier, subtle enough to almost disappear, yet present enough to feel different from the days before. The 4 of them remained near the hearth, each shaped by the same long day, each carrying the same quiet fatigue. No one rushed to lie down. The moments before rest had their own slow rhythm, small adjustments, final checks, the careful placement of what little remained for tomorrow. The man examined one of his tools again, running his fingers along the worn handle, feeling for weaknesses that might not yet be visible. The woman folded a piece of cloth with deliberate care, smoothing its surface as though the act itself carried importance beyond necessity. The child leaned closer to the fire, watching the movement of flames with heavy eyes. The stranger sat slightly apart, though not as distant as before. Their posture had changed, not fully relaxed, but less guarded. Their hands rested still now, no longer trembling, no longer searching for warmth with the same urgency. Time passed without measure. Eventually, one by one, they settled into their places for the night. The fire was reduced carefully, not extinguished, not allowed to grow, left in that narrow space where it could survive until morning without consuming too much. The house grew quiet again. Outside, the wind shifted, moving more freely now across the open spaces between homes. It carried with it fine snow, barely visible, brushing lightly against walls and doorways, collecting in thin, uneven layers. The world beyond remained unchanged, cold, distant, indifferent. Sleep came slowly, not all at once, not completely. The body rested because it had to, not because it was fully at ease. Even now, with the addition of another presence, the instinct to remain aware lingered beneath the surface. The man woke once during the night, his awareness rising without clear cause. For a moment, he remained still, listening. The same quiet filled the room, the same steady breathing, the same faint crackle of embers. But something else lingered. Not a sound, not a movement, just a sense that the balance had shifted again, in some small, almost unnoticeable way. He turned his head slightly. The stranger remained where they had settled, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of breath. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Still, the feeling remained. After a moment, it faded. Not gone, but less defined, blending back into the quiet of the night. He lay still again, allowing rest to return in its slow, uneven way. Hours passed. The cold reached its peak once more before dawn, pressing inward with that same patient persistence. The fire dimmed further, its glow barely holding on beneath layers of ash. The warmth it offered was minimal now, but enough to mark the difference between inside and out. Then, gradually, the darkness began to thin. Morning returned, as it always did, without warmth, without brightness, only a subtle shift from black to gray. This time, the stranger woke first. The movement was slight, almost silent. They sat up slowly, their eyes adjusting to the dim interior. For a moment, they did not move further. They simply observed. The room, the fire, the others. There was a stillness in that moment that felt different from the rest. Not unfamiliar, but more deliberate. As if something was being measured, considered, understood. Then quietly they moved. The hearth was approached first. Without hesitation, without guidance, they began the process of stirring the embers, uncovering the faint heat beneath the ash. The motions were careful, precise, neither rushed nor uncertain. A small piece of kindling was added, then another. The flame returned slowly. By the time the man woke, the fire had already begun to rebuild itself. He noticed immediately, not with surprise, but with recognition. Their eyes met briefly. No words followed. The woman rose next, her routine unchanged, though her movements adjusted slightly to what had already been done. There was less to restore, less to prepare. A small shift, but enough to be felt. The child woke last again, blinking slowly, drawn first to the fire, then to the subtle movement within the room. The morning began, but something within it had changed. The tasks that followed were no longer carried by three alone. The rhythm, once fixed and narrow, had expanded slightly, allowing space for another set of hands, another awareness moving within it. The man prepared to leave once more, gathering what was needed. This time, the stranger stood as well, not immediately stepping forward, not assuming, but present. There was a pause, a brief moment where nothing was decided aloud. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible motion, the man adjusted the tools in his hand, leaving one behind. Not offered directly, not explained, just left. The stranger noticed. A second passed. Then they stepped forward, taking the tool with quiet understanding. No agreement was spoken, but it was made. Outside, the cold remained unchanged, greeting them both with the same sharp edge as before. The village stirred around them, its patterns repeating, its movements steady and familiar. This time, two figures moved beyond the paths instead of one. Their pace was not perfectly matched, their movements not entirely synchronized, but they moved in the same direction, guided by the same purpose. Behind them, the woman continued her work, now with a slightly different balance to the day. The child remained close, watching, learning, adjusting to a world that had shifted just enough to feel new, though nothing obvious had changed. Beyond the village, the land stretched out as it always had, cold, silent, unyielding. But now, there were two sets of footsteps marking the snow, two patterns crossing the same ground. And as the morning settled into its slow, steady rhythm once more, the quiet endurance of the days continued, unchanged in its hardship, yet no longer carried in quite the same way as before. The snow beneath their feet carried a faint, brittle sound as they moved farther from the village. Two sets of footsteps forming a quiet pattern across the pale ground. The air felt sharper out here, less interrupted by walls or structures, moving more freely across the open land. Each breath came out in slow, visible clouds, fading quickly into the gray stillness. They walked without speaking. There was no need for direction. The path, if it could be called that, was shaped by habit and necessity rather than design. The man led slightly, his pace steady, his movements familiar with the terrain. The stranger followed, adjusting naturally, neither too close nor too distant. The trees ahead stood thin and bare, their branches reaching upward like dark lines against the sky. Snow gathered unevenly at their bases, and the ground beneath them was harder, less forgiving. The wind moved differently here, weaving through the trunks, creating soft, shifting sounds that echoed faintly in the quiet. When they reached the edge of the wooded area, the man slowed, not to stop, but to observe. His gaze moved across the ground, scanning for signs, fallen branches, weakened limbs, anything that could be taken without unnecessary effort. The stranger did the same. It was subtle, but clear. Their eyes moved differently, not searching randomly, but with purpose. They stepped slightly to one side, crouching near a partially buried branch, brushing away snow to reveal its condition, testing it, measuring its worth. The man noticed. Again, no words. Work began. They moved separately at first, each following their own rhythm. The man focused on what he knew areas that had yielded something before, places where wood might still be found beneath the surface. The stranger worked more slowly, more deliberately, selecting fewer pieces, but with careful attention to their quality. Time passed in quiet motion. The cold made everything heavier. Movements that would have been simple in another season now required effort. Fingers stiffened quickly, grip weakened, breath shortened slightly with exertion. Still, both continued without pause. At one point, the stranger approached a thicker fallen limb, partially frozen into the ground. Instead of trying to break it immediately, they examined it first, its angle, its tension, the way it rested against the earth. Then, with a controlled movement, they adjusted their stance and applied pressure at a specific point. The wood split, not easily, but cleanly. The sound carried briefly through the trees before fading again into silence. The man glanced over just once. There was no reaction on his face, but the observation remained. Gradually, the piles began to form. Not large, not enough to remove the uncertainty of the days ahead, but enough to justify the effort. Enough to continue. The light above shifted slightly, though it never brightened fully. The sky remained a dull gray, the sun hidden behind layers that allowed only a faint, diffused glow to reach the ground. As time moved forward, the man gathered his portion, binding it in a way that allowed it to be carried efficiently. The stranger did the same, though their method differed slightly, more compact, more balanced. Another small difference. When they began the walk back, their pace adjusted naturally. The added weight slowed them both, but not enough to disrupt the steady rhythm of movement. Their footsteps fell into a pattern not identical, but consistent. Halfway back, the wind shifted. It came from a different direction this time, carrying with it a sharper edge. The air felt thinner, colder, moving more forcefully across the open ground. Snow lifted lightly from the surface, drifting in small, uneven swirls that crossed their path without warning. They did not stop, but their movements changed. Each step became more deliberate, each breath slightly more controlled. The cold pressed harder now, finding its way through layers, settling against skin with renewed persistence. The village appeared ahead, its shapes faint at first, then gradually clearer through the moving air. Smoke still rose from a few homes, thin and steady, a sign that life continued within. As they approached, the sounds of the village returned, subtle, muted, but present. A distant movement, a faint creak, the quiet continuation of daily routine. They entered without announcement. No one stopped them. No one questioned. Movement in and out of the village was not unusual, though it was always noticed, just not always acknowledged. Back inside the house, the warmth, though limited, felt immediate in contrast to the wind outside. The woman glanced up briefly as they entered, her attention moving quickly across what had been brought back. Not counting, not measuring exactly, but understanding. The child looked as well, eyes following the motion of the bundles being set down. The small pieces separated and placed near the hearth. The stranger moved without hesitation now, placing their gathered wood where it would be most useful, adjusting its position slightly as if already familiar with the space. The man did the same. No instruction was given. None was needed. The fire was fed carefully, bringing a slightly stronger warmth into the room. Not enough to change the air entirely, but enough to push back the cold just a little more than before. The midday meal began again. This time, the portions were nearly the same as the day before. Still small, still measured, but steadier. The woman added another small amount of the herbs, adjusting the mixture with quiet care. The scent rose again, faint but noticeable, blending with the usual smell of smoke and worn wood. They ate together, 4 figures, moving in quiet coordination, the rhythm of the act unchanged, yet no longer unfamiliar in its new form. Afterward, the tasks of the afternoon continued, but now the work divided more naturally. The man turned to repairing a section of the outer structure where the wood had begun to weaken. The stranger followed, not waiting for instruction, but observing the process closely before stepping in where needed. Their movements aligned more easily this time, not identical, but complementary. One held, the other adjusted. One tested, the other secured. The structure held. Inside, the woman worked with fewer interruptions, her pace steady, her attention less divided than before. The child moved between spaces, carrying small items, watching everything, learning without being told. The light began to fade once again. Evening approached with the same quiet certainty, drawing the day inward, slowing movement, reducing sound. The village followed its familiar pattern, each home closing itself against the cold, each fire becoming the center of a small, contained world. Inside, the 4 gathered once more. The fire burned a little stronger tonight, not by much, but enough to be felt, enough to change the space in a way that did not need to be spoken. No one mentioned it. No one needed to, because the change was already there, in the shared work, in the adjusted rhythm, in the way the silence no longer felt quite as empty as it once had. And as night settled in again, stretching long and cold across the land, the steady continuation of their days moved forward, unchanged in its hardship, but carried now by more than before. Evening settled fully, and the faint improvement in warmth lingered just enough to be noticed before slowly giving way to the familiar chill. The fire held steady, fed with care from what had been gathered earlier. Its glow stretched a little farther across the floor tonight, touching corners that had remained dim on previous nights. It was not comfort in any lasting sense, but it was something small, fragile, and temporary. The 4 of them remained close, their positions no longer uncertain or newly arranged. What had once required silent adjustment now felt almost natural, as if the space had always been meant to hold this number. Movements overlapped without interruption. When one shifted, another adjusted without thought. The man rested his hands near the fire, turning them slightly to warm both sides evenly. The stiffness in his fingers had not fully faded from the day's work, but it had lessened. Across from him, the stranger mirrored a similar posture, though their hands bore different marks, small cuts, faint scars, signs of work done elsewhere, in other conditions, over a longer span of time. The woman watched the fire for a moment, then reached for the small bundle of herbs again. This time, she did not open it fully. Instead, she adjusted its wrapping, ensuring it remained protected. It was no longer just an unfamiliar addition. It had become something to preserve. The child, quieter now, leaned slightly forward, watching each small action with careful attention. There was less hesitation in their gaze. The presence of the stranger had shifted from unfamiliar to something else, not quite known, but no longer distant. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing more firmly against the walls. It carried a soft, uneven rhythm, moving through narrow spaces, tracing the outlines of the village. Snow followed with it, light at first, then slightly heavier, drifting across the ground and gathering along the edges of structures. The man turned his head slightly, listening. The sound was not unusual, but there was something in its pattern that suggested a change. Not immediate, not urgent, but different enough to notice. The stranger seemed to sense it as well. Their gaze lifted briefly toward the door, then returned to the fire. No one spoke, but the awareness remained. As time passed, the snow outside continued to build, quietly layering over the ground, softening edges, filling in spaces. The paths that had been formed earlier in the day began to disappear once more, replaced by an even, undisturbed surface. Inside, preparations for the night began again. The fire was adjusted carefully, not allowed to burn too high, not allowed to fade too low. The wood gathered earlier gave them slightly more to work with, but not enough to remove caution. Every piece still mattered. The man rose briefly, moving toward the door. He did not open it fully, only enough to feel the air beyond. The cold pressed in immediately, sharper than before, carrying with it the fine movement of falling snow. He closed the door again, without stepping outside. That was enough to understand. When he returned to his place, nothing was said. But the rhythm of the room shifted slightly. The night would be colder. The morning would be harder. They settled down once more. The arrangement now required no adjustment. Each found their place without hesitation, the shared warmth forming naturally between them. The fire dimmed slowly, its glow softening, its light pulling inward as the room prepared for rest. Sleep came as it always did, gradual, uneven, shaped by the limits of the body. rather than the comfort of the space. Outside, the snowfall continued. It moved steadily now, not driven by strong wind, but falling with quiet persistence. Layer upon layer formed across the village, covering roofs, filling pathways, pressing gently against doors. The world beyond the walls softened into silence. Hours passed. The fire burned low, its warmth fading into a faint presence. The cold pressed inward again, stronger than before, filling every space it could reach. Sometime in the deeper part of the night, the stranger woke. Their movement was slow, careful, but deliberate. For a moment, they remained still, listening to the quiet of the room, the softened sound of wind outside, the muted hush that snowfall brings. Then they sat up. The fire was nearly gone. Only a faint glow remained beneath the ash. The others slept, their breathing steady but shallow in the cold. Without hesitation, the stranger moved toward the hearth. The motions were familiar now, though shaped by their own rhythm. Ash was shifted. The faintest trace of heat was uncovered. A small piece of wood was added, then another, placed with precision to encourage flame without wasting fuel. The fire responded slowly. A flicker, then another. It grew just enough. Not bright, not strong, but alive again. The stranger remained there for a moment, watching, ensuring it would hold. Then, quietly, they adjusted one more piece, angling it slightly to control the burn. Only then did they return to their place. The warmth, though slight, spread gradually. It reached the others before they woke, easing the cold just enough to allow rest to continue without interruption. Morning came later than before. The sky, when it finally lightened, carried a heavier gray tone. The snowfall had not stopped. It had thickened. When the man woke, the first thing he noticed was the fire. It was still alive, more than it should have been at this hour. His gaze shifted. The stranger remained still again, as though they had never moved. Nothing was said, but the understanding deepened. The woman rose next, her attention moving immediately to the door. Before opening it, she paused, sensing the difference. Then, slowly, she pulled it open just enough to see. Snow, more than before. It had gathered high against the threshold, pressing inward, reshaping the ground beyond. The familiar paths were gone entirely now, replaced by a smooth, unbroken layer that stretched across the village. She closed the door again. No words were needed. The day ahead would not follow the same pattern. The man stood, preparing as always, but his movements carried a slight adjustment. The usual tasks would be harder now, slower, more uncertain. This time, when he reached for his tools, he did not leave one behind. Instead, he handed it directly to the stranger. A small difference, but clear. The door opened again, this time fully. The cold entered immediately, sharper, heavier, carrying with it the quiet weight of deep snow. They stepped out together. Their feet sank deeper with each step. the ground no longer firm beneath them. Movement required more effort now, more awareness, more time. Behind them, the door closed. Inside, the woman and child remained, the fire steady, the space quiet. Outside, the village had changed overnight. Not in structure, not in form, but in movement. Everything would take longer now. Everything would require more. And as the two figures began to carve a new path through the untouched snow, the steady rhythm of survival continued, reshaped once again by the quiet, relentless force of winter. The snow resisted each step, rising nearly to their knees in places, shifting unevenly beneath their weight. What had once been a simple path was now something that had to be made again, one movement at a time. The man moved first, pressing forward, creating a narrow trail through the soft but heavy layer. The stranger followed closely behind, stepping into the same impressions, conserving effort where possible. The cold felt different now, not sharper, not harsher, but heavier. It lingered in the air, settled into clothing more deeply, slowed the body in ways that were difficult to ignore. Breathing became more deliberate, each inhale carrying the dry chill further into the chest. They did not travel as far as before. It became clear quickly that distance would not be measured the same way today. Each step demanded more energy. Each movement required more time. The rhythm they had established over the past days shifted again, adapting without pause, without discussion. The man angled slightly toward a line of trees that stood closer to the village than those they had worked before. It was not ideal. Much of what could be gathered there had likely already been taken. But today was not a day for distance. It was a day for what could be reached. The stranger adjusted without hesitation. Together, they moved slowly, breaking through the snow, leaving behind a path that would not last long if the snowfall continued. Their progress was marked only by the effort it took to continue. When they reached the trees, they paused not to rest, but to assess. The snow had settled unevenly among the trunks, drifting higher in some areas, leaving others partially exposed. Branches that might have been visible before were now hidden beneath the surface. What could be gathered had to be found again, uncovered, tested. The man began first, using his foot to push aside the top layer of snow, revealing what lay beneath. Some pieces were too small, too damp, too weak to be worth the effort. Others held just enough promise to justify the work. The stranger moved differently. Instead of searching broadly, they focused on areas where the snow had gathered less densely, near the base of certain trees, where wind had shifted it away. There, smaller branches could be found more easily, their condition clearer, their use more certain. They worked in silence, their movements steady despite the added resistance. At one point, the man slipped slightly, his foot losing stability beneath a hidden ridge. The movement was small, quickly corrected, but enough to remind him, and the one beside him, easily balance could be lost in these conditions. The stranger glanced over, not reacting, but acknowledging. Then the work continued. The piles they gathered were smaller today, not from lack of effort, but from limitation. The environment itself set the boundaries now. It decided how much could be taken, how far they could go, how long they could remain. Time moved slowly, stretched by the effort of each task. The sky above remained unchanged, a flat gray that offered no sense of passing hours. Eventually, the man straightened, his breath heavier now, though still controlled. He looked over what had been gathered. It was not much, but it was enough for now. The stranger did the same. Their bundles were formed carefully, adjusted for balance more than size. Carrying too much would slow them further, increase risk. Carrying too little would not justify the effort. There was a narrow space between those 2 points. They found it without speaking. The return began. This time, the path they had created helped, but only slightly. The snow had already begun to soften the edges, filling in parts, reshaping others. Still, it provided some guidance, some small reduction in effort. Their pace remained slow. The wind shifted again, carrying loose snow across their path, brushing against their legs, their clothing, their faces. It was not strong enough to stop them, but enough to remind them that nothing remained fixed for long. As they moved closer to the village, the outlines of the homes emerged gradually, softened by the layer of snow that had settled over everything. Roofs appeared heavier, doorways narrower. The entire place seemed quieter than before, as if the snowfall had absorbed even the smallest sounds. They reached the house without pause. The door opened with slight resistance. Snow gathered at its base, pushing inward. The man cleared just enough space to allow entry, then stepped inside, followed by the stranger. The warmth, though still limited, felt stronger than the air outside. Not because it had changed, but because the contrast had deepened. Inside, the woman had already begun adjusting the space to account for the conditions. A small section near the door had been cleared, allowing for easier movement. The fire had been maintained carefully, its heat steady, its fuel managed with precision. The child sat closer than before, wrapped more tightly, watching as the two returned. Their gaze lingered on the snow clinging to clothing, the slower movements, the quiet signs of effort carried back inside. The wood was set down, sorted again without delay. Smaller pieces placed near the hearth, larger ones set aside, nothing left unattended. The stranger moved naturally within the space now, no longer hesitating before acting. A piece of snow was brushed away from the floor. A damp section of wood repositioned to dry. Small adjustments that fit seamlessly into the rhythm already in place. The man noticed. Again, nothing was said. The midday meal came sooner than usual, not because time had passed more quickly, but because energy had been spent more heavily. The body required something to continue, even if what was given was small. The woman prepared it as before, adding only what could be spared. The herbs were used carefully, less this time, stretched further, preserved where possible. They ate together. The silence remained, but it had changed. It no longer carried the same distance as before. It felt shared. Afterward, the tasks of the day did not extend as far. The conditions outside had already set limits. Instead, attention turned inward. Repairs that had been delayed. Adjustments that could not be ignored. The man worked along the inner wall, reinforcing a section where the wood had begun to shift slightly. The stranger joined, not waiting to be asked, but moving into place with quiet certainty. Their hands worked together, aligning, holding, securing. The structure strengthened. The woman focused on what remained, organizing, preserving, ensuring that nothing was lost to carelessness. The child remained close, assisting in small ways, learning the patterns that now included one more presence. The light outside faded slowly, though it had never been bright to begin with. Evening returned with the same quiet weight, settling over the village, softening its edges further under the growing layer of snow. Inside, the fire burned steadily. A little more wood was used tonight, not wastefully, but with understanding. The day had required more, and so a little more was given back. The four gathered again as the night closed in, their positions natural now, their movements aligned in ways that no longer required thought. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the rhythm held, unbroken, adjusted, and carried forward, one slow, deliberate moment at a time. The night pressed in more heavily than before, not with sudden force, but with a steady accumulation that could be felt in the walls, in the air, in the quiet weight of everything around them. The fire held its place at the center of the room, its glow steady, its warmth carefully sustained. They remained gathered near it, their movements slower now, shaped by the effort the day had demanded. No one shifted unnecessarily. No one wasted energy. Even small gestures carried purpose, an adjustment of position, a hand extended toward the heat, a piece of wood placed with care. The snow outside continued its silent descent. It softened the edges of the village further, filling spaces that had already been filled, layering over paths that had only just been made. The world beyond the walls became quieter still, as if sound itself had been absorbed into the growing depth. Inside, the air held steady. The man watched the fire for a long moment, his gaze following the slow movement of flame along the edges of the wood. There was a pattern to it, a rhythm that could be understood if one looked long enough. It told him how long it would last, how much more could be added, how much needed to be saved. Across from him, the stranger sat in a similar stillness, though their attention moved slightly differently. Their eyes traced not just the fire, but the room, the walls, the placement of objects, the subtle movements of the others. It was the kind of observation that came from habit, from time spent in unfamiliar places, learning quickly what could not be explained. The woman adjusted the fire once more, placing a small piece of wood into the coals with practiced precision. The flame responded immediately, rising just enough to maintain its strength without consuming too much. The child, quieter than before, leaned closer, eyes fixed on the shifting light. There was something calming in it, something steady in a world that rarely offered such things. Time moved slowly. Eventually, they settled again for the night. The arrangement required no thought now. Each found their place, their position shaped by the need for warmth and the understanding of shared space. The fire dimmed gradually. The room grew colder. Sleep came in fragments. Outside, the snowfall began to ease, not stopping entirely, but slowing enough that the air felt different. The wind carried less movement now, allowing the snow to fall more gently, more evenly. Sometime deep into the night, the man woke again. This time, it was not a sound that stirred him. It was the absence of one. The wind had quieted almost completely. The soft brushing against the walls had faded, leaving a deeper silence in its place. It was the kind of stillness that felt heavier, more complete. He remained still, listening. The fire had nearly gone out again, its glow faint beneath the ash. The others slept, their breathing steady, unchanged. But something else had shifted. He rose slowly, careful not to disturb the others, and moved toward the door. Each step was measured, the floor beneath him responding with the same faint creaks as before. At the door, he paused. Then slowly, he opened it. The cold entered immediately, but it felt different now. Not carried by wind, not pushed with force. It simply existed, still, heavy, complete. Outside, the world had changed. The snowfall had stopped. What remained was a thick, unbroken layer that covered everything. The ground, the roofs, the paths, all buried beneath a smooth, undisturbed surface. No movement, no sound, just stillness. The sky above remained gray, but lighter now, hinting at the approach of morning. He stepped out slightly, just enough to see further. The village lay quiet beneath the snow. No signs of activity yet. No figures moving between homes. Even the faint traces of earlier days had disappeared completely. It was as if everything had been reset. He stood there for a moment longer, taking it in. Not with wonder, not with concern, just recognition. This was what followed heavy snowfall. Stillness before movement returned. He stepped back inside, closing the door carefully behind him. The room felt smaller after seeing the outside, more contained, more defined. He returned to the hearth, stirring the embers once more. The faint glow responded, slowly rebuilding under his guidance. By the time the others woke, the fire had returned to a steady burn. The woman moved toward the door soon after, opening it just enough to see what he had already seen. Her reaction was no different. A brief pause, a quiet understanding. Then the door closed again. The child, waking last, sensed the difference without needing to see it. The stillness carried inward, shaping the air within the room. The stranger rose as well, their movements steady, their awareness immediate. They did not approach the door, but they understood. The day ahead would not begin as usual. The man prepared as always, gathering what was needed. But this time, his movements slowed slightly, not from fatigue, but from calculation. The effort required to move through such depth would be greater. The distance they could travel would be less. He turned to the stranger, meeting their gaze briefly. No words were spoken, but the understanding was clear. When the door opened again, it revealed the same unbroken surface. No path, no guidance, only snow stretching evenly in every direction. They stepped out together. The first step sank deep, then another. Each movement required force now, lifting the body higher, pushing it forward against resistance that did not give easily. Behind them, the door closed once more. Inside, the woman and child remained, the fire steady, the space quiet. Outside, the world waited, not hostile, not welcoming, just present. And as they began to move forward, carving a new path through the untouched surface, the rhythm of survival continued, slower now, heavier, shaped by the quiet aftermath of the storm. The first stretch of movement was the hardest. The snow had no memory of where to give way, no path to follow, no softened trail beneath their feet. Each step sank deep, forcing the body to lift higher than it wanted, to press forward with more strength than it had readily available. The rhythm they had relied on before no longer applied. The man moved first, as he always did, but his pace had changed. Slower, more deliberate, each step placed with care, not just for balance, but to shape the ground behind him into something that could be used again. The stranger followed closely, placing their feet into the same impressions, reducing effort where possible. Even this small efficiency mattered now. The air remained still. Without wind, the cold felt different, less sharp, but more complete. It surrounded them evenly, settling into their clothing, their breath, their movements. Sound carried more clearly in this stillness, though there was little to hear beyond the quiet compression of snow beneath their steps. They did not aim for distance today. That much was understood immediately. Instead, they angled toward areas that might still offer something within reach. A cluster of trees, partially visible beneath the weight of snow, stood not far from the village. It was closer than where they had worked before, but distance was no longer the measure of success. Reaching it took time, more than it should have, but eventually they arrived. The trees stood quiet and unchanged, their branches holding layers of snow that threatened to fall with the slightest disturbance. The ground beneath them was uneven, shaped by roots, and frozen earth hidden beneath the surface. The man paused, scanning the area. Not quickly, not impatiently, just observing. The usual signs were harder to read now. What had once been visible was buried. What had once been easy to judge now required effort to uncover. The stranger moved first this time. They stepped toward a tree where the snow had gathered less densely, brushing aside the top layer with controlled movements. Beneath it, a small branch lay partially exposed, its surface dry enough to be useful. They tested it. It held. With a firm motion, they broke it free, the sound sharp in the still air before fading into silence. The man watched briefly, then moved to another spot, repeating a similar process. Work resumed, slower than before, more deliberate. Each piece had to be uncovered, examined, judged. There was no gathering quickly, no collecting in handfuls. Everything required attention. Time stretched. The sky remained unchanged, offering no sense of passing hours. The stillness persisted, unbroken by wind or movement. Even their own presence felt muted, as if the snow absorbed more than just sound. At one point, a branch above shifted under its weight. Snow fell suddenly, dropping in a soft but heavy cascade. It struck the ground beside them, sending a faint cloud upward before settling again. Both paused, not out of fear, but awareness. The environment had its own movements now, subtle but constant. Weight shifted, surfaces changed. What appeared stable might not remain so. They adjusted accordingly, choosing their positions more carefully, avoiding areas where snow gathered too heavily above. The piles they formed were small, but each piece mattered. Eventually, the man straightened again, his breath slower now, heavier. Not exhausted, but closer to it than before. He looked over what they had gathered. It was not much, but it would have to be enough. The stranger did the same, securing their bundle with care. There was no hesitation when they turned back. The return was harder. The path they had made earlier had already begun to soften, its edges collapsing slightly under the weight of fresh snow settling into place. Still, it offered some guidance, some reduction in effort. They followed it closely. Each step still required force. Each movement still demanded attention. But the direction was clear, and that was enough. The village appeared slowly, its shapes softened further by the thick covering. Roofs seemed lower, walls less defined. The entire place felt quieter, as though it had been wrapped in something that absorbed motion itself. They reached the house without pause. The door opened with effort this time. Snow pressed firmly against it, resisting the movement. The man cleared space with his foot, pushing the buildup aside just enough to create an opening. They stepped inside. The warmth, the though still modest, felt stronger than ever. The difference between outside and inside had grown wider, more noticeable. The woman looked up immediately, her gaze moving quickly across what they carried. No counting, no measuring, just understanding. The child shifted closer, watching as the snow was brushed away, as the wood was set down, as the rhythm of the house adjusted once again to what had been brought back. The stranger moved without hesitation now. Their place in the pattern had settled. They placed their bundle alongside the others, adjusting its position slightly to keep it dry, to make it accessible. The man did the same. The fire was fed, carefully, a little more than before. Not wasteful, but necessary. The room responded slowly, the warmth spreading just enough to ease the cold that had followed them inside. The midday meal came quietly, prepared with the same care, the same restraint. The herbs were used again, though sparingly. Their scent rose faintly, blending with the familiar smell of smoke and worn wood, creating something that felt almost steady. They ate together, 4 figures, moving in quiet coordination, their actions no longer separate, but shared. Afterward, the day did not extend outward. There was no reason to push further. The conditions had already set the limit. Instead, the work turned inward again. The man checked the structure near the door, reinforcing the lower section where snow pressed against it from outside. The stranger joined, understanding the need without explanation. Their movements aligned quickly, hands working together in a rhythm that no longer felt unfamiliar. Inside, the woman adjusted supplies, ensuring that nothing would be lost to dampness or neglect. The child remained close, assisting in small ways, learning the patterns that now included more than before. The light outside began to fade once more. Evening returned. The village, though unseen beyond the walls, followed the same quiet pattern, each home closing in, each fire becoming its own center. Inside, the fire burned stronger tonight, not by much, but enough to feel, enough to matter. They gathered once more, closer now, not just from necessity, but from something that had formed slowly, without being named. Outside, the snow remained undisturbed. Inside, the rhythm held steady, unbroken, carried forward, step by step, through the stillness that winter had left behind. The fire held its strength a little longer that night, the added wood allowing its warmth to stretch further before slowly retreating. The 4 of them remained gathered in its glow, their positions no longer tentative, no longer newly formed. What had once required silent adjustment had become instinct. No one spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said. The day had already taken what it required. The night would do the same. Outside, the stillness remained unbroken. The snow no longer fell, but it had not settled completely either. It shifted in small, nearly invisible ways, settling into itself, tightening, pressing down into the shapes beneath it. The village rested beneath it, quiet and contained. Inside, the fire began its slow decline. The man watched it for a while, as he often did, reading its movement, judging how long it might last. His hands rested near the warmth, though he no longer turned them as frequently. The heat reached him more evenly now, or perhaps he had simply grown used to its limits. Across from him, the stranger remained still, their posture relaxed in a way that had not been seen before. Not completely at ease, but no longer guarded. Their attention moved less now, no longer tracing every edge of the room, no longer measuring each movement of the others. The woman adjusted a small piece of wood in the fire, then withdrew her hand, letting it settle into place. The child leaned quietly against her side, eyes following the slow shift of flame. Time passed. Eventually, rest came again. They lay down as they had before, close together, sharing what little warmth remained. The fire dimmed, its glow softening into faint embers beneath ash. The room cooled gradually, the cold returning in slow, steady layers. Sleep followed its familiar pattern light, interrupted, never fully complete. Hours moved quietly through the darkness. Then, sometime before morning, a sound broke the stillness. It was not loud, but it did not belong. The man's eyes opened immediately. He did not move at first. He listened. There it was again, a faint, dull pressure. Not wind, not falling snow, something against the outside. He rose slowly, careful not to disturb the others. The cold met him immediately, sharper now that the fire had nearly faded. Still, he moved toward the door, each step measured, controlled. The sound came once more, closer now, a soft, uneven push. He reached the door and paused, his hand resting against the wood. The cold from outside pressed through, steady and unmoving. For a moment, he did nothing. Then slowly, he opened it. The snow resisted. It had built higher during the night, pressing firmly against the entrance. The door moved only a short distance before stopping, but it was enough. Through the narrow opening, the outside world appeared once again, still, pale, unchanged in its silence. And then, just beyond the edge of the doorway, something shifted. A small movement. Not the wind, not falling snow. Something beneath the surface. The man narrowed his gaze, focusing on the shape barely visible against the white. Another movement, slower this time. Strained, he opened the door a little further, pushing against the weight of the snow until the gap widened just enough to see clearly. There, partially buried, was a form, small, unmoving, except for the faintest shift. Not an animal, too still for that. A person, or what remained of one. The man did not hesitate. He stepped forward, the snow rising around his legs as he moved. Each step broke through the surface with effort, but he did not slow. Reaching the figure, he bent down, brushing away the snow with quick, controlled movements. The form beneath became clearer, thin, wrapped in layers that had long since lost their warmth, barely holding shape against the cold. The slightest movement confirmed it. Alive, but not for long. He did not look back. Instead, he lifted the figure carefully, adjusting his grip to support what little strength remained in the body. It was lighter than expected, too light. Turning, he moved back toward the house, each step heavier now, the added weight pressing against already tired muscles. Behind him, the snow began to settle again, filling in the marks left by his movement. Inside, the woman had woken. The change in air, the open door, the absence, it had been enough. She stood now, watching as he returned, her expression unchanged, but her attention sharpened. The stranger had risen as well, already moving to clear space near the fire. The child stirred, not fully awake, but aware enough to sense that something had shifted. The man stepped inside, lowering the figure carefully onto the cleared space. Snow clung to the outer layers, melting slightly in the warmth before freezing again. The door was closed quickly behind him, sealing out the cold once more. For a moment, no one moved. Then, without instruction, they began. The woman knelt beside the figure, her hands moving with quiet urgency. Layers were adjusted, loosened, checked. The stranger moved closer, assisting without hesitation, their movements precise, practiced. The man added wood to the fire more than before. Not measured this time, not careful in the same way. The flames rose higher. The warmth increased. The air shifted. The figure did not respond immediately. Their breathing was faint, uneven, barely visible. Their skin, where it could be seen, carried the pale stillness of someone who had been too long in the cold. Time stretched. No one spoke. Every movement had purpose. The child watched from a distance now, fully awake, silent, still. Gradually, the smallest change appeared. A breath slightly deeper than before. Then another. The woman adjusted the coverings again, pulling them closer, guiding the warmth toward where it was needed most. The stranger supported the movement, ensuring nothing was wasted, nothing misplaced. The man remained near the fire, feeding it, watching it, holding it at a level that pushed back against the cold as much as possible. Outside, the village remained silent, unaware. Inside, the rhythm had shifted again, not by choice, not by plan, but by necessity. And as the fire burned stronger than it had in many nights, the small space held now 5 figures instead of 4, each one bound. In that moment, by the same quiet effort to hold on against the cold, the fire burned higher than it had in many nights, its light pushing deeper into the corners of the room, its warmth pressing back against the cold that had settled into every surface. The air felt different, thicker, almost strained, as if the space itself were adjusting to what had been brought inside. No one stepped away. The woman remained closest to the figure, her hands moving with steady purpose, adjusting layers, checking for any response, however small. The stranger stayed beside her, their movements precise, their attention focused on details that might have gone unnoticed before: how the fabric lay, where the warmth gathered, how the breath rose and fell. The man fed the fire again, more wood than usual, not carelessly, but without the same restraint. This was not a moment for measured preservation. This was something else. The flames responded, rising stronger, casting sharper shadows along the walls. The heat spread unevenly, but more forcefully than before, reaching further into the room. The child watched in silence, drawn closer now, though still at a careful distance. Their eyes moved between the figure on the ground and the shifting light of the fire, sensing the weight of what was happening without fully understanding it. Time passed slowly. The figure did not move at first. Their breathing remained faint, uneven, barely there. The cold had settled deep, beyond what could be seen, beyond what could be easily undone. The woman adjusted the coverings again, pulling them tighter, then loosening them slightly, finding the balance between warmth and pressure. Her movements were calm, controlled, not rushed, not uncertain. The stranger reached for the small bundle of herbs. This time, there was no hesitation. They opened it fully, selecting a small portion, crushing it gently between their fingers before placing it near the fire. The scent rose slowly, stronger than before, filling the air with something sharper, something that seemed to cut through the heaviness of the room. The woman noticed. She did not question. Instead, she adjusted her position slightly, allowing the warmth and scent to move more freely toward the figure. The man remained where he was, his attention fixed on the fire, maintaining its strength, ensuring it did not falter. Minutes stretched into something longer. Then, a shift, small but clear. The figure's breath deepened slightly, the chest rising a fraction more than before. It was not steady, not strong, but it was different. The woman leaned closer, her hands still, her focus sharpened. Another breath followed, then a pause, then another. The pattern began to form, uneven but present. The stranger adjusted the coverings again, lifting a small section, then placing it back down, guiding the warmth more precisely. Their movements carried a familiarity that did not belong entirely to this place, but fit within it all the same. The child shifted slightly closer, drawn by the change, their gaze fixed, unblinking. The man added one more piece of wood. The fire held, the warmth remained, and slowly the figure responded. A faint movement of the hand, barely visible, but enough. The woman saw it immediately. Her fingers moved gently, not gripping, not forcing, just there, steady, allowing the motion to continue if it could. The stranger watched closely, their posture still, their attention unwavering. Another breath, slightly deeper. The room seemed to hold that moment, every movement slowing, every sound fading beneath the quiet intensity of it. Then, gradually, the figure's eyes opened, not fully, just enough to catch the light. The reaction was subtle, no sudden movement, no clear recognition, just a brief flicker of awareness before the eyes closed again. But it was enough. The woman exhaled slowly, a breath she had not realized she was holding. The man did not turn, but his posture shifted slightly, a small release of tension passing through him. The stranger remained still, though their gaze softened, the sharpness of their focus easing just slightly. The child leaned back a fraction, the intensity of the moment settling into something quieter. The figure remained where they were, their breathing still uneven but present, their body no longer completely still, no longer entirely taken by the cold. The fire continued to burn. The herbs continued to release their faint, sharp scent. The room held steady. Outside, the village remained silent beneath the snow, unchanged, unaware. Inside, the rhythm had shifted again, not broken, but stretched, expanded to hold more than before. The woman adjusted the coverings once more, ensuring the warmth remained where it was needed. The stranger carefully set aside what remained of the herbs, wrapping them again with the same care as before. The man reduced the fire slightly now, bringing it back under control, returning it to something that could last. Balance once again. The child settled closer to the wall, still watching, but quieter now. Time moved forward. The figure did not wake again immediately, but their breathing remained steady enough, their presence anchored just enough, that the urgency began to fade into something more controlled. The danger had not passed, but it had changed. The room adjusted to this new state slowly, each person returning, piece by piece, to the rhythm they knew, though now it carried one more presence, one more quiet breath moving within it. And as the fire settled into a steady burn once more, the long, quiet work of waiting began. The waiting stretched into something without clear edges, a quiet span of time measured only by the steady rise and fall of breath and the slow settling of the fire. No one spoke. No one moved more than necessary. The urgency that had filled the room before had not disappeared. It had simply changed shape, becoming something quieter, more patient. The figure lay near the hearth, wrapped carefully, positioned where the warmth could reach without overwhelming. Their breathing, though still uneven, held a fragile consistency now. Each inhale came slightly deeper than before, each exhale a little less strained. The woman remained closest, her attention steady, her hands resting lightly on the coverings, as if ready to adjust at the smallest sign of change. She did not watch constantly, but she did not look away for long. The stranger sat nearby, their posture composed, their awareness still sharp, but no longer tense. From time to time, they leaned forward slightly, observing details others might miss, faint shift of color in the skin, the pattern of breath, the way warmth spread unevenly beneath the layers. The man stayed near the fire, maintaining it with care once again. The earlier intensity had passed, and now he worked to hold it at a level that would last. Each piece of wood was placed with purpose, each adjustment measured. The child, quieter than ever, sat close to the wall, watching everything with a stillness that had grown deeper over the past days. Outside, the world remained unchanged. The snow lay thick and undisturbed, holding the village in a kind of suspended silence. No footsteps, no distant movement, just stillness stretching in every direction. Inside, time moved slowly. At some point, the figure stirred again. It was not sudden, a slight movement of the head, barely perceptible at first. Then a faint shift in the shoulders beneath the layers. The woman noticed immediately, her hand adjusting gently, offering support without pressure. The stranger leaned closer, their gaze focused. The man did not turn, but he paused in his movement at the fire. Another breath came deeper now, then a quiet sound. Not a word, just a faint, strained exhale that carried something more than breath alone. The figure's eyes opened again. This time, they remained open longer. The light from the fire reflected faintly in them, unfocused at first, then slowly sharpening. The room came into view in fragments, the glow of the hearth, the outline of the woman, the presence of others beyond. Confusion passed through their expression, though it was weak, subdued by exhaustion. The woman spoke then. Her voice was low, steady, carrying no urgency, no demand, just a simple presence. The words were few, quiet, meant not to question, but to ground. The figure listened, though it was unclear how much was understood. Their gaze shifted slightly, moving from one shape to another, trying to make sense of what surrounded them. The stranger remained still, allowing the moment to settle without interruption. The man returned to the fire, adjusting it once more, keeping the rhythm intact. The child leaned forward slightly, eyes wide but silent. The figure attempted to move. It was small, barely a lift of the arm before it fell back again. The effort too much. The woman responded immediately, steadying the movement, preventing strain. Her hands guided gently, not forcing, not resisting, just supporting. Another breath, then another. The figure's awareness seemed to come and go in waves, clarity fading and returning in brief moments. But each time it returned, it held a little longer. The stranger reached for a small container, offering a minimal amount of water. Not much, just enough. The woman accepted it, carefully guiding it to the figure, allowing only a small sip. It was enough. The figure swallowed with effort, the motion slow but successful. A small step. The room remained quiet, but something within it had shifted again. The waiting was no longer for survival alone. It had moved into something else, recovery. However uncertain, however fragile. The fire continued to burn steadily. The herbs, though now set aside, still lingered faintly in the air. The cold remained outside, pressing against the walls, unchanged. But inside, the balance held. The figure's breathing steadied further, not strong, but consistent enough to ease the tension that had filled the space before. The woman adjusted the coverings once more, then allowed her hands to rest. The stranger leaned back slightly, their posture easing, though their attention remained present. The man sat closer to the fire now, his movements slower, less driven by urgency. The child shifted, settling into a more relaxed position, though still watching. Time continued. The figure's eyes closed again, but not in the same way as before. Not lost, not fatting, resting, and as the quiet rhythm of the room returned once more, shaped now by 5 steady breaths instead of 4, the long stretch of winter continued, unchanged in its demands, yet carried forward by a presence that had been pulled back from its edge. The rest came more naturally now, though it was still fragile, still shaped by the limits of the body rather than comfort. The figure near the fire no longer seemed suspended between presence and absence. Their breathing, while not strong, had settled into something steady enough to hold. No one moved too far from their place. The woman remained close, though her posture had softened. Her hands no longer hovered in constant readiness, but rested nearby, prepared without urgency. The stranger sat just beyond, their attention still quiet and observant, but no longer fixed on every small detail. The man leaned slightly back from the fire, his work returning to its usual rhythm. Even the child, after watching for what felt like a long time, allowed their gaze to drift, their body settling into a more relaxed stillness. The room had changed again, not in size, not in structure, but in tension. The sharp edge that had filled it before had eased, replaced by something slower, steadier. Outside, the stillness remained. The snow had not shifted. The village stayed quiet beneath its weight, waiting, as it always did, for movement to return. Inside, the fire burned at a controlled level, its warmth held carefully, its light steady and contained. Time passed. At some point, the figure stirred again. This time, the movement was clearer. A slow shift beneath the coverings, followed by a faint tightening of the hand. The woman noticed, turning her attention immediately, though her response remained calm. The figure's eyes opened once more. They stayed open. The gaze moved slowly, taking in the room again, more steadily now, less clouded. The fire, the walls, the shapes around them. Recognition did not come all at once, but awareness did. The woman spoke again, her voice as low and even as before. The words were simple, repeated in the same tone, offering something consistent to hold on to. The figure's lips moved slightly. No sound came at first. Then, after a moment, something faint barely formed, more breath than voice. The effort was enough to stop them. The woman did not press. She simply remained there, steady, allowing the moment to pass without demand. The stranger reached again for the small container, offering another minimal amount of water. This time, the figure responded more clearly, accepting it with less strain, though still slowly. The man watched from where he sat, his gaze steady but unobtrusive. The child leaned forward again, curiosity returning, though still quiet, still contained. The figure's breathing remained even. Their gaze, though still tired, moved with more purpose now. They looked at the woman, then at the stranger, then briefly toward the man by the fire. Something passed through their expression then. Not fear, not relief, something quieter, understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of it. Their eyes closed again, but not fully, just enough to rest, to gather what little strength had returned. The room remained still. The fire continued its steady burn. Outside, the silence held. Gradually, the rhythm of the house resumed its usual flow. Not fully, not as it had been before, but close enough. The man rose briefly to adjust a section near the door, clearing a small amount of snow that had pressed inward again. The stranger assisted without being asked, their movements aligned, efficient. The woman remained near the figure, though she began to shift her attention between tasks again, no longer fixed entirely in one place. The child moved quietly, bringing a small item closer to the fire, then returning to their spot. The day moved forward, slowly, measured not by light, which remained dim and constant, but by the steady continuation of small tasks. The figure rested, waking only briefly at intervals, each time a little more aware, a little more present. Their strength did not return all at once. It came in small, uneven steps, each one fragile, each one hard one. Food was prepared again, divided carefully. This time, a portion small but deliberate was set aside. Not given immediately, but held, waiting for the moment when it could be taken without harm. The herbs were used again, even more sparingly now. Their presence in the air had become familiar, something expected, something that carried quiet value. When the figure woke again, the woman offered a small amount of food. The response was slow, careful, but accepted. Another step. The stranger watched closely, ensuring nothing was rushed, nothing forced. The man remained near the fire, his role unchanged, his presence steady. The child observed, learning without being told. Outside, the snow remained undisturbed. Inside, life continued, not easily, not comfortably, but steadily. And as the light outside faded once more into the long stretch of evening, the five of them gathered again near the fire, no longer uncertain, no longer newly arranged. The space had expanded once more, not by size, but by what it held, and in that quiet, steady warmth, as the night returned and the fire burned on, the rhythm of survival continued, now now shared among one more breath, one more presence, carried forward into whatever the next day would bring. The night stretched on, heavy and deliberate, holding the house in its quiet weight. The fire cast long, flickering shadows across the walls, throwing every object into sharper relief. Each shadow seemed to sway with the slow rhythm of the flames, painting the room with a steady, almost hypnotic movement. The figure, now more aware, shifted slightly, easing their body against the coverings. Their breathing remained steady, though uneven at times, punctuated by faint, small sighs of effort as muscles remembered movement after being dormant for so long. The woman stayed close, her presence unwavering. She did not speak, knowing that the quiet itself had a value that words could not replace. Each adjustment of the blankets, each subtle shift of her hands, was precise, deliberate, measured to guide warmth without suffocating, movement without strain. The stranger watched silently, hands folded, eyes scanning for anything the woman might have missed. Their posture was alert but calm, a quiet readiness that had become instinct. The man remained near the fire, monitoring its burn carefully. He adjusted pieces of wood now and then, not out of necessity, but to maintain balance, enough heat for the figure, enough light to see clearly, but never so much as to waste precious fuel. The child, finally, leaned closer to the figure, small hands folded, eyes wide and still. Not afraid, not curious in the ordinary sense, but watching with a silent, careful attention, as if knowing that every breath, every small movement carried importance. Outside, the snow remained unmoved. Its smooth, unbroken surface reflected no trace of human presence beyond the house. The village lay dormant, wrapped tightly in silence, while the world pressed lightly against the walls, steady and cold. Inside, the rhythm of survival had shifted into a slower, more deliberate cadence. Time became measured not by hours, but by the movements of the room, when the figure shifted, when the fire responded, when the air inside began to feel warmer or colder. The figure lifted a hand slowly, lifting it over the blankets, as if testing the strength in the muscles. The movement was tentative, almost imperceptible, but it was a statement of presence. The woman adjusted the blankets gently, supporting the movement without pressure. The stranger leaned closer, noting the slight increase in responsiveness. The man added another small piece of wood to the fire. Its glow brightened, casting light across the faces of everyone in the room. The child reached out slightly, placing a small hand on the edge of the blankets, feeling the warmth. Their fingers traced a careful path, uncertain, but intent on connecting with the figure. The figure's eyes flicked toward them briefly, and for the first time since being discovered, there was recognition in the gaze. Not words, not comprehension fully formed, but a moment of understanding. It passed quickly. The woman spoke then, softly, quietly, her voice almost a whisper carried in the firelight. She did not ask. She did not demand. She simply offered a sound, a connection, a thread for the figure to grasp. Another breath. The figure responded faintly, shifting slightly, curling just a little closer into the blankets. The stranger reached for the water once again, offering it carefully. The figure accepted, swallowing slowly, deliberately, with effort. Each action was small, but together they built something larger. The night deepened, but inside, the room held warmth steadily. The rhythm of small movements, careful attention, and measured effort persisted, linking all five together in a silent, shared focus. Time passed in this way, quietly measured, until the first pale hint of morning light crept across the snow outside. It was weak, faint, almost hesitant, but enough to shift the shadows, to make the shapes in the room more defined, to hint at the passage of hours without announcing them loudly. The figure moved again, slightly stronger this time, lifting their head a little higher, rolling their shoulders just enough to ease stiffness. The woman guided each motion with her hands, subtle and patient. The stranger adjusted coverings where needed, making room without force, ensuring balance and stability. The man added just enough wood to maintain the fire at a sustainable level. Its warmth pressed outward, filling the room, lending strength not just to the figure, but to all who shared the space. The child leaned closer once more, eyes bright, taking in the subtle shifts, the small signs of progress, understanding more than words could say. The figure's breathing steadied further, more regular now. The small sounds, soft sighs, tiny shifts, faint murmurs carried weight in the quiet room. Outside, the snow reflected the pale morning light, untouched and perfect, indifferent to what had occurred within the walls. Inside, life had returned, though not in its usual form. It was slower, harder, but it existed. And as the fire burned steadily, as warmth filled the space, as each person played their part in careful coordination, the rhythm of survival moved forward once more, deliberate, fragile, unbroken, and shared among 5 breaths instead of 4. The day was beginning, even if slowly, even if quietly, and they were ready to meet it. The figure stirred again as the morning light grew slowly across the snow-laden village. Their movements were slightly stronger now, less hesitant, more intentional. A small hand lifted and rested briefly on the blankets, then sank back down, a subtle test of strength and coordination. Each motion was measured, deliberate, cautious. The woman observed quietly, ready to support, but giving enough space for the figure to reclaim movement on their own. She adjusted the layers around them gently, easing weight where it pressed too hard, shifting coverings to allow warmth to reach the body more evenly. The stranger moved with similar care, arranging the blankets and the small bundle of supplies to maintain balance. Nothing was rushed, no motion wasted. Every adjustment carried meaning. The man remained near the fire, feeding it in small increments. Its flames rose higher, throwing warmth across the room without overwhelming the figure or drying the air too much. He watched the figure carefully, noting each shift, each breath, each subtle sign that strength was returning. The child, sitting against the wall, leaned forward again, observing closely. Their small hands rested on their knees, body still, eyes following every motion in quiet attention. Outside, the snow reflected the weak morning light. The world beyond the walls seemed unchanged, a frozen expanse of white, stretching in every direction, silent and still. The village lay blanketed and dormant, no hint of life beyond what was contained within the house. Inside, life had begun again, tentatively, quietly, but unmistakably. The figure lifted their head, turning slightly, eyes blinking to adjust to the dim but steady glow of the firelight mixed with the morning outside. Recognition began to form in the gaze, focusing first on the woman, then the stranger, and briefly on the man by the hearth. No words came yet, but understanding was present. The woman spoke softly, barely above a whisper. Her voice carried calm, carrying steady reassurance rather than instruction. The figure's lips moved slightly in response, forming shapes that were too faint to be words, but enough to show effort, to show intention. The stranger offered a small cup of water. The figure accepted it carefully, lifting it slowly to their lips, pausing when the effort seemed too great, then resuming. Each sip was measured, deliberate, and completed with small, faint exhalations of relief. The fire flickered, throwing light across the room. Shadows danced across faces, but each presence remained steady, unshaken. The child watched the interplay, absorbing the subtle cues of movement, learning in silence the rhythms of survival, the delicate balance of care and observation. Minutes passed in quiet, each small motion meaningful. The figure shifted again, this time raising their shoulders, then their arms, testing the strength in muscles that had long been dormant. They pushed lightly against the blankets, feeling the resistance, adjusting instinctively to the weight, testing endurance. The woman adjusted her hands to guide without forcing. The stranger assisted subtly, making room, ensuring warmth was consistent. The man monitored the fire, maintaining balance, ensuring that it provided light and heat, but did not threaten with excess. The child's eyes widened slightly at a small gesture of success. The figure had lifted their head higher, turned it more intentionally, focused gaze more clearly. Outside, the first weak light of day reflected across the snow, pale and unsteady, casting faint shadows that crept slowly across the ground. The stillness pressed in on all sides, but the movement inside held stronger weight. The figure tried to sit up, halting almost immediately as muscles resisted. The woman steadied them gently, supporting without strain. The stranger adjusted coverings, giving space while maintaining warmth and stability. The man fed the fire again, maintaining its steady burn, watching the figure closely. Another small shift, a hand moving, an arm lifting slightly revealed incremental progress. Each motion was small, but it mattered. The figure's eyes remained open, scanning the room more intentionally, more steadily. Recognition deepened. Understanding began to anchor itself. The woman spoke again, soft, low, repetitive, but consistent. The figure's breathing followed, steadier than before, more synchronized with the rhythm of the room. The stranger adjusted a blanket over the figure's shoulders. The motion was careful, precise. Each fold, each placement carried thought. The child shifted closer, watching silently, learning from the subtle motions, the careful attention, the slow, deliberate rebuilding of strength. The figure took another sip of water, then another, each one slightly easier than before. They tested the movement of their legs carefully, bending slightly at the knees, lifting slowly, then returning to rest. The fire flickered, a gentle reminder of warmth, life, and the careful work of maintenance. The room settled into this rhythm. Small movement, gentle support, measured warmth, quiet observation. Each presence contributed, each breath counted. Outside, the snow remained unmoving, the village still blanketed in white silence. But inside, life returned, tentative but undeniable. The figure lifted their head once more, turned their gaze toward the woman, then the stranger, and finally toward the man. A faint shift of the lips hinted at intention. Not words yet, but something approaching connection. The day had begun, even if slowly, even if quietly. And inside, survival continued patient, deliberate, fragile, unbroken. The quiet persisted as the morning light deepened, pale, and filtered through the snow-laden windows. The figure remained partially reclined, but their movements were becoming more purposeful, less hesitant. Each breath drew slightly deeper. Each motion carried a hint of regained strength, as though the body remembered what it had forgotten. The woman stayed close, adjusting coverings as needed, her hands light but guiding. She spoke only occasionally, in a low, steady voice, each word more of an anchor than instruction. The figure's gaze followed her movements, lingering, tentative, but more intentional with every passing moment. The stranger remained near, sitting silently, monitoring without interference. Their presence was unobtrusive, but constant, ensuring that every adjustment and movement was supported, every potential strain mitigated. They occasionally reached forward, shifting blankets or offering water, each action precise, deliberate, careful. The man tended the fire, feeding it in measured bursts, ensuring it remained steady, but never overwhelming. He glanced at the figure periodically, watching for subtle changes in posture, for the faintest signs of regained strength, for any hint that the body had begun to respond on its own. The child, quiet and observant, leaned closer to the figure, eyes wide and intent, following every movement. They were learning without being instructed, absorbing the subtle cues of care, the rhythm of attention and survival, the delicate balance between action and patience. The figure moved again, lifting an arm slightly, then lowering it. They shifted on their side, testing the muscles in their back and legs. Each motion caused small, careful adjustments from the woman and the stranger, ensuring warmth was maintained, strain minimized. Another breath, deeper than before. Another faint murmur, nearly inaudible, almost drowned out by the fire's crackle. The figure's eyes focused more clearly, first on the woman, then the stranger, then the man near the fire. Recognition flickered briefly, a momentary connection, but it was enough to anchor their presence. The woman adjusted the blankets once more, moving slowly, deliberately. She leaned forward, offering a hand to steady the figure, but allowed them to initiate the motion, giving space for agency while still providing support. The figure's lips moved slightly, attempting to form words. A faint sound emerged, weak but deliberate. The woman did not respond immediately, allowing the attempt to settle before offering a low, steady acknowledgement. The stranger placed a small cup of water within reach. This time, the figure lifted it more confidently, their grip firmer, their posture steadier. They swallowed deliberately, releasing a faint exhalation of effort. The man added another piece of wood to the fire, and the flames rose higher, casting light and warmth evenly across the room. Shadows danced across the walls, but they no longer carried the tension of earlier days. The child leaned forward slightly, following the subtle progress, absorbing the rhythm of care and recovery, learning the slow, deliberate language of survival. The figure's movements became more frequent. They lifted a hand to push hair away from their face, then shifted slightly to ease stiffness in their shoulders. Their legs bent and stretched carefully, testing the strength that had lain dormant. The woman guided each motion, steadying without force. The stranger adjusted blankets and layers to maintain balance and warmth. The man monitored the fire, ensuring a steady heat that would support their progress. The figure's eyes followed each presence in the room, connecting more intentionally. Recognition deepened, awareness sharpened, and for the first time, a faint sense of focus and understanding returned. The child's gaze followed the subtle transformations, absorbing lessons that required no words, patience, observation, support, and the delicate balance of life against the cold. The figure shifted again, more confidently, their breathing steady, each motion deliberate. They attempted to sit upright, halting briefly as muscles protested, then continuing with careful, deliberate effort. The woman provided support at each stage, guiding without force. The stranger adjusted the blankets and fire warmth, ensuring comfort without interference. The man maintained the fire, steady and patient, as a constant presence. A small moment passed, a shared rhythm of care and recovery. The figure's lips moved again, forming faint sounds that hinted at words, at intention, at awareness returning. The woman responded softly, reinforcing the thread of connection without pressure, without rush. The stranger observed, hands ready to assist, but unmoving, ensuring that every action and reaction unfolded naturally. The child leaned forward slightly, eyes bright and focused, absorbing the fragile interplay of recovery, support, and survival. Outside, the snow reflected the morning light, pale and soft, untouched, a silent world pressing against the walls. Inside, life moved carefully, deliberately, but undeniably forward. The figure raised their head higher, scanning the room with increasing awareness. Their body began to respond more fully, muscles remembering movement, strength returning in cautious increments. The woman guided gently, the stranger supported subtly, the man maintained warmth, and the child observed with quiet intensity. The rhythm of life had returned, fragile but persistent. And as the fire burned steadily and the light of morning filtered into the room, the long, slow recovery continued, deliberate, patient, and unbroken. The day was underway, and inside, the morning settled deeper into the room, pale light spreading across the snow-covered landscape outside the windows. Inside, the fire had stabilized, its warmth filling the corners and lending life to the room in gentle waves. The figure, now more conscious, shifted again, rolling slightly onto their side and attempting to lift themselves more fully. Each movement required effort, but the persistence in their motions was undeniable. The woman remained close, her hands guiding lightly, subtly, never forcing. She adjusted the blankets, lifted layers, and ensured warmth reached where it was needed most. Her presence was quiet but constant, an anchor for the fragile body regaining strength. The stranger moved with careful precision, making small adjustments to keep balance and prevent strain. They offered water again, a few drops at a time, monitoring the figure's reactions closely. Every slight movement, every tremor, every shift of breath was noted, acknowledged, and accommodated. The man tended the fire steadily, feeding it in measured increments. The flames licked the walls with controlled energy, providing warmth and light without overwhelming the space. He observed the figure closely, noting improvements in posture, breath, and small motions that suggested incremental recovery. The child leaned slightly forward, watching intently. They understood, in the way children sometimes do, the subtle language of care and effort unfolding before them. Every gesture, every motion, every careful adjustment carried meaning that needed no explanation. The figure moved again, lifting a hand and extending it toward the firelight. Their fingers trembled, but the motion was deliberate. Recognition of surroundings began to take shape, even if words had not yet returned. The woman spoke softly, offering a thread of communication. Her words were simple, low, steady, meant to anchor the figure without overwhelming them. Their lips parted slightly in response, forming faint murmurs, sounds of effort rather than full comprehension. The stranger placed a small bowl of warm broth nearby. The figure reached toward it, hands uncertain but purposeful, and lifted it to sip slowly, deliberately. Each swallow an act of rebuilding strength. The child watched closely, silent, absorbing the rhythm of care, of patience, of deliberate action. The man adjusted the fire once more, ensuring consistent warmth as the room's balance shifted around the figure's recovery. The flames cast gentle, flickering shadows across the walls, painting the space with life and continuity. Minutes passed, quiet, but full of motion. The figure attempted to shift more fully, rolling onto their back and testing their legs, flexing muscles that had lain dormant. Their breath deepened, more regular, more controlled. The woman guided gently, ensuring the body was supported. The stranger adjusted blankets and layers, balancing warmth and comfort. The man's steady attention to the fire maintained a constant environment for the fragile restoration taking place. Another faint sound came from the figure, a whispered syllable, half-formed, fragile, but present. Recognition glimmered in their eyes, moving from the woman to the stranger to the man. Awareness returned incrementally, a careful, steady thread of understanding woven through exhaustion and cold. The child leaned forward slightly, eyes bright, absorbing the delicate interplay of care and recovery. Each movement, each breath, each small response built on the last, strengthening not just the figure, but the rhythm of the entire room. The figure attempted to sit upright, trembling slightly as they lifted themselves. The woman's hands steadied without constraining. The stranger supported subtly, adjusting coverings and providing warmth. The man watched closely, adjusting the fire to maintain steady heat. A slow exhale escaped the figure's lips, a sign of effort and presence. Their head lifted, eyes scanning the room more clearly, connecting with each of the 5 presences surrounding them. Recognition deepened, a fragile understanding forming. The room held steady. The fire burned steadily. The light outside grew gradually brighter, reflected in the snow beyond. The rhythm of life continued, delicate but unbroken, each small motion building on the last. The figure shifted again, moving their legs cautiously, testing strength, discovering capability. Another sip of broth, another deep breath, another faint attempt at speech, each step deliberate, each effort rewarded. The woman's voice remained low, steady, guiding, without interruption. The stranger's movements continued precise, thoughtful, minimal, but supportive. The man maintained the fire's heat, rhythmically feeding it as needed. The child observed quietly, internalizing every subtle cue. The figure's awareness continued to strengthen. Their body responded slowly but clearly to the warmth, the support, and the care surrounding them. Each motion built confidence, each breath reinforced presence, each faint sound signaled a return of agency. Outside, the village remained silent beneath the weight of snow. Inside, the room carried a fragile, deliberate rhythm of life. The day had begun fully now, even if quietly, even if slowly. And within these walls, the five of them, connected through effort, observation, and survival, continued forward together.